In 1997, the world's most famous technology company was exactly 90 days away from total annihilation. They were hemorrhaging over $1 billion a year. Their stock was practically worthless. The media had already written their obituary. And yet they didn't just survive. They conquered the globe. They didn't do it by immediately inventing a groundbreaking new computer. They didn't do it by outspending their rivals. They did it by making a deeply controversial deal with their absolute worst enemy. They did it by systematically killing almost every single product they sold. But the actual mechanism behind their resurrection isn't just a business pivot. It is a psychological masterclass in extreme subtraction. It is a framework of ruthless focus that almost no one truly understands. We are going to reveal exactly what that framework is and how you can apply it a little later in this breakdown. First, we need to understand the mess. We need to look at the bloated, confused, and dying entity that was Apple Computer in the late 1990s. So how did a company that was losing $1 billion a year, drowning in unsold inventory, go from the absolute brink of bankruptcy to becoming the most valuable company in the history of human commerce? That is the exact question we are answering today. To understand the miracle, you have to witness the tragedy. Let's go back to 1996. Steve Jobs had been exiled from his own company for over a decade. In his absence, Apple had lost its mind. They weren't just a computer company anymore. They were trying to be everything to everyone. They sold printers. They sold scanners. They sold digital cameras. They even sold a bizarre, overpriced video game console called the Pippin. It was pure chaos. Apple had over 350 different products on the market. Just buying a simple Macintosh computer required navigating a labyrinth of confusing model numbers, overlapping features, and wildly varying price points. Consumers were paralyzed. The paradox of choice had completely destroyed the brand's identity. Behind the scenes, the operations were even worse. Apple had massive factories churning out beige boxes that nobody wanted to buy. Inventory was piling up in warehouses, rotting away as technology advanced. The company had a staggering 2 months of unsold inventory sitting idle. In the tech world, where components become obsolete in weeks, that is a death sentence. Apple was burning through cash at an apocalyptic rate. The CEO at the time, Gil Amelio, was desperately trying to keep the ship afloat. But the hull was breached. The water was pouring in. The board of directors knew they needed a miracle. They needed a new operating system to save their hardware. They looked outwards. They found a struggling software company called NeXT. And the CEO of NeXT happened to be the man who founded Apple in his parents' garage. Steve Jobs was coming home, but he was returning to a burning building. When Jobs walked back into the Apple campus as an advisor, he was disgusted. He spent days wandering the halls, demanding that executives explain the product line to him. Nobody could. The executives themselves were confused by the sprawling, toxic mess of hardware they were manufacturing. This was the ultimate dip, the lowest possible point on the corporate J-curve. Apple was functionally dead. They had alienated their core users. They had allowed Microsoft's Windows 95 to completely monopolize the personal computing market. They had even started licensing their own operating system to third-party manufacturers, creating cheap Mac clones that cannibalized their own hardware sales. Jobs knew that incremental change would not save Apple. Amputation was required. He didn't start by designing the iMac. He started by firing people. He started by killing projects. He walked into a meeting with the executives, grabbed a marker, and drew a simple grid on a whiteboard. 2 columns, 2 rows, 4 quadrants. Above the columns, he wrote 2 words: consumer and professional. Next to the rows, he wrote 2 more: desktop and portable. That was it. That was the entire survival strategy. Jobs declared that Apple would build exactly 4 great computers. One desktop and one laptop for regular consumers. One desktop and one laptop for professionals. Everything else was dead. The room went completely silent. This meant killing 70% of Apple's hardware and software products. It meant firing thousands of employees. It meant wiping out entire divisions of the company overnight. It was brutal. It was terrifying. But it was absolutely necessary. By eliminating the bloat, Jobs stopped the financial bleeding. He slashed Apple's massive, bloated inventory from 2 months down to less than 1 week. He completely severed the cloning licenses, ensuring that if you wanted the Mac experience, you had to buy Apple hardware. But cutting costs doesn't generate revenue. Apple still needed cash to survive while they built those 4 core products. They needed a lifeline. And so Steve Jobs did the unthinkable. He called Bill Gates. At the 1997 Macworld Expo, Jobs stood on stage and announced a sweeping partnership with Microsoft. Microsoft committed to releasing Office for the Mac for the next 5 years. Most importantly, Microsoft invested $150 million directly into Apple. The crowd actually booed. They hissed. They viewed Microsoft as the evil empire. But Jobs looked out at the angry audience and told them the cold, hard truth. He said that if Apple was going to win, they had to let go of the idea that for Apple to win, Microsoft had to lose. Apple had to win by being Apple. The cash injection bought them time. The four-quadrant matrix gave them focus. Now they had to execute. The first product born from this ruthless focus was the iMac G3. It wasn't just a computer. It was a statement. While every other PC on the market was a hideous, complicated tower of beige plastic and tangled wires, the iMac was a sleek, translucent, brightly colored all-in-one machine. It looked like something from the future. It looked friendly. And crucially, it was incredibly easy to use. You took it out of the box, plugged in one cable, and you were on the internet. The iMac was a massive commercial success. It proved that Apple wasn't dead. It proved that design mattered just as much as processing power. But the iMac was just the beginning of the climb. Jobs realized that the personal computer was changing. It wasn't just for spreadsheets and word processing anymore. It was becoming the center of people's digital lives. It was becoming a digital hub. People were ripping CDs, downloading MP3s, and shooting digital video. But managing all of those files across different devices was a nightmare. Apple decided to solve that friction. They built iTunes to manage music. They built iMovie to edit video. They built iPhoto to manage pictures. They made the Mac the undisputed master of your digital universe. But there was one missing piece. To truly control the digital hub, Apple needed a portable device. They needed to take your digital life out of your living room and put it in your pocket. In 2001, they released the iPod. 1,000 songs in your pocket. It was brilliant. It was simple. And it featured a revolutionary click wheel that made navigating a massive music library effortless. But the iPod wasn't just a music player. It was a Trojan horse. The iPod only synced seamlessly with iTunes. And at first, iTunes was only available on the Mac. If you wanted the best portable music experience in the world, you were heavily incentivized to buy an Apple computer. This was the birth of the ecosystem, the invisible web that would soon ensnare billions of people. When Apple eventually opened iTunes to Windows users, the iPod sales exploded. Suddenly, millions of PC users were holding a piece of Apple hardware. They felt the build quality. They experienced the intuitive software. They realized what they had been missing. This halo effect had begun. People bought an iPod, loved it, and when it was time to buy a new computer, they bought a Mac. This entire turnaround, from the brink of death to the birth of the iPod, was driven by one single, overriding philosophy. And this brings us to the core insight. The absolute secret behind Apple's resurrection. Apple is not a technology company. They are a focus company. Their strategy was never about building everything. It was about building almost nothing. By actively choosing what not to do, they freed up the capital, the engineering talent, and the marketing bandwidth to make the few things they did choose to do absolutely perfect. This is the power of extreme subtraction. When you have 300 mediocre products, your messaging is confused. Your quality control is impossible. Your customers are alienated. When you have 4 brilliant products, your message is a laser beam. Your quality is legendary. Your customers become evangelists. But pulling this off requires an almost painful level of organizational discipline. It requires the ability to look at a good idea, a profitable idea, and say no, simply because it doesn't fit the core focus. During Apple's dark days in 1996, the company's biggest vulnerability wasn't a lack of talent. It was a total lack of internal alignment. Teams were siloed. Projects were redundant. Information was scattered across 1,000 different, disconnected systems. They were drowning in their own operational noise. This is exactly why modern companies use powerful central hubs to manage their entire workflow. If your team is scattered across a dozen different apps, losing track of documents, and duplicating work, you are suffering from the exact same bloat that almost killed Apple. That is where Notion comes in. Notion is the ultimate workspace that brings your entire company together. Instead of having your strategy in a chaotic mess of shared folders, your project management in a clunky software tool, and your internal wikis lost in endless email chains, Notion centralizes everything. It forces clarity. It creates a single source of truth for your entire organization. If you want to apply the Apple philosophy of ruthless focus to your own business, you have to clean up your internal operations first. Notion allows you to build custom workflows, track projects flawlessly, and keep every single team member perfectly aligned with your core strategy. It is the digital equivalent of Steve Jobs wiping the whiteboard clean and drawing that simple, focused four-quadrant grid. You can try Notion for free by clicking the link in the description below and start building your own centralized hub today. When you strip away the legend, the turtleneck, and the keynote speeches, Apple's strategy is blindingly simple. Say no to 1,000 things. Build a closed, perfectly integrated ecosystem. And design the user experience so beautifully that leaving the ecosystem feels like a downgrade. The return of Steve Jobs wasn't magic. It was the brutal, unyielding application of focus. It was the understanding that in a world of infinite noise, the most valuable commodity is clarity. If you learned something new, hit the like button and subscribe for more strategy breakdowns. And let us know in the comments, what company's strategy should we unlock next?